Hi there, I'm Andrew McDermott. Well, quite a few books have had a big impact in history. The Iliad of Homer, the Gallic Wars of Caesar, the Annals of Tacitus, the plays of Euripides, Plato's Republic, and that's just the ancient ones. There's so many influential modern classics too. But when it comes to the foundations of Western civilization, there's one book that rises above the rest for its importance and enduring influence. It was critical to the development of Western conceptions of law, literature, medicine, science, and human rights. The people, places, and events recorded in it have been of the utmost importance to human society and culture over the last 2 millennia. I'm speaking about the Bible. At the Discovery Institute, we believe that Western culture, conceived by the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, and Christians, and elaborated in the American founding, has encouraged creativity, enabled discovery, and promoted the Judeo-Christian values that undergird our religious, political, and economic liberty. Today, though, the Bible is under attack. It's been disregarded as historically inaccurate, primarily mythological, or even a work of propaganda. These views are held by the majority of modern scholars, and by much of the general public. According to these views, the Bible is irrelevant to our world today, an interesting collection of fanciful tales and people, but nothing more. But what if that idea is wrong? What if there's ample evidence to suggest the Bible is an historically reliable text, a trustworthy source of history and wisdom? What if we could corroborate or verify the historicity and accuracy of the Bible? To probe these questions, I'm pleased to be speaking again with Dr. Titus Kennedy, a professional field archaeologist, adjunct professor at Biola University, and research fellow at Discovery Institute. Titus works primarily with sites and materials of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. He has been involved in archaeological projects at 18 different sites, including directing and supervising multiple projects spanning the Bronze Age through the Byzantine period, and he has conducted artifact research at museums and collections around the world. He earned his doctorate from the University of South Africa, focusing on archaeological demographics and the Late Bronze Age, master's degrees from the University of Toronto and the University of South Africa, and a BA from Biola University. Titus has been a consultant, writer, and guide for history and archaeology documentaries and curricula. He's author of 3 books on the archaeology of the Bible: Unearthing the Bible, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and his latest book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands. Titus, welcome back.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to be back. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. Well, in our first session together, we explored the content of your first solo book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. We took a closer look at just a handful of those 101 artifacts and how they corroborate events, people, and places that were reported in the biblical text. You just released a 3rd book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands, or Biblical Lands, and we'll dive into that one in our 3rd and final session together. But today, I'd like to discuss the content of your 2nd book, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, again to help us with a central question: can the New Testament Gospels be viewed today as historically reliable? In short, can we trust them? This is a key question in any defense of Western culture and values. The evidence you document in your books suggests that we can confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible. So let's unpack some of your findings. In Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, you present archaeological and historical findings that illuminate and corroborate the life, times, and person of the most well-known and influential figure in human history, Jesus of Nazareth. First, let's look at how the person of Jesus is viewed. What do scholars say about the historical Jesus versus what popular culture might say?
Well, in general, scholars, especially those who are in ancient history, archaeology, biblical studies, they would almost universally say that yes, Jesus existed, he was a real person, there is historical evidence for that. Whereas in the general public, you may run into people who claim that there is no historical evidence outside of the Bible that Jesus ever existed and that he was some kind of fairy tale person. Again, this is not what's thought in scholarship. However, within academia, there are a lot of different views on who was the historical Jesus or what do we know about him. Those ranging from the Gospels are historically reliable. We can get all sorts of information about the historical Jesus from the Gospels and the New Testament, to those who think that, yes, Jesus existed, but we don't really know anything about what actually happened from the Gospels, which they would characterize as mythological or legendary or just kind of supernatural spiritual propaganda.
Okay. And of course, a lot of time has passed, so it's understandable that some would prefer that sort of narrative or understanding of it. But does it hold up to all the archaeological discoveries and analysis? Well, you write that in addition to Matthew and Luke, secondary sources from antiquity, including even those hostile to Christianity, reference the birth of Jesus and corroborate details found within the narratives. What kind of written evidence from ancient authors outside of the New Testament do we have for the existence of Jesus?
So, addressing the birth of Jesus section, that comes from a quote by Celsus, who lived in the 2nd century, and he was a fierce critic and opponent of Christianity, and yet he knew about Jesus, he knew about the birth of Jesus, and he knew some interesting details, such as him being born in a village in Judea, which that would fit Bethlehem, it would not fit Nazareth. He knew about the odd situation around his birth, that the virgin birth claim had been made. Now, his explanation is that there was adultery going on, but of course, Joseph was concerned with people thinking that. He also knew that Jesus's earthly father was a carpenter, and he knew that the family went early in the childhood of Jesus to Egypt. So he was aware of many details around the birth and early infancy childhood of Jesus. All in all, though, we have 11 different sources from the 1st and 2nd century that mention Jesus as an historical person and contain some kind of information about events in his life, whether it's the birth or whether it's the trial of Jesus or his disciples, things like that. And only 2 of those are Christian. One is Christian and one is quoted by a Christian. So these are what we might call qualifying as more objective sources from a secular perspective. That is, they're not New Testament Christian sources. So one cannot just throw them off and say, this is just Christian propaganda. It's actually people who are opposed to Christianity who are even writing about Jesus.
Okay. So the birth of Jesus, well attested by extra biblical sources. So why do some still claim that Jesus didn't exist? I mean, what's driving that?
I think that it's their bias against the Bible and against the New Testament and also against Jesus and Christianity. So if they can make the claim that Jesus never even existed, then they don't have to deal with any of the more difficult questions. They just start from the base and throw out the base of it, and then there's no more discussion to be had.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, we're dealing with 2 separate things. Did the man exist? Or, did he actually say things? And, can we corroborate those types of things? Archaeology can't address all of it, but it can certainly point the way regarding the first type of inquiry. Well, what about people and places in the Gospels? Are there many archaeological discoveries related to these, such as the birth and ministry periods of Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some different sites like Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jerusalem, the region of Galilee. So Bethlehem, we know archaeologically, people were living there at the time of the birth of Jesus. Same with Nazareth. And Nazareth was occupied by Jews who were both agriculturalists and artisans, and they were observant of the Mosaic law. So that fits the family of Jesus perfectly. Jerusalem as well, of course. There's no debate over that, but the temple, for instance, which Jesus visited, that is well attested archaeologically and historically in the 1st century.
Okay. Now, you tell us the story of the Galilee boat that was found in 1986 in your book. How does that illuminate the historical context of first century Galilee and the life of Jesus?
Well, we only knew about these boats from literary texts in the past, such as the Gospels. Josephus also talks about these boats, how they could hold, up to 15 people. So that would fit perfectly for Jesus and his 12 disciples. But then this boat was discovered, the actual remains of it, and it was buried under the mud from the first century. And it was the same size of boat that Jesus and his disciples took. It's the same type that's described by Josephus. And so now we had physical remains of this type of boat right there on the shore of Galilee, where Jesus used these boats to get around the lake.
Wow. And it's amazing how these things get found. I mean, some discoveries are made when people are actually looking for them, and others, they just sort of happen. I mean, this was the result of a drought, wasn't it?
Yeah, the lake was low at that point, and there were these two brothers who, they were always interested in finding something like that, an ancient boat. So they had their eyes peeled for it, and they noticed something sticking out of the mud, and they went and investigated, and it turned out to be the remains of this ancient first century boat.
Wow. Well, what about the miracles of Jesus? Is there archaeological evidence and analysis that can support any of the Bible's claims about the miracles that Jesus performed?
What we have is archaeological evidence of locations where Jesus performed some of these, as well as ancient manuscript copies that discuss different perspectives on the miracles of Jesus. So, for example, in the book of John, in Jerusalem, there are a couple of important locations of the miracles of Jesus. There's the pool of Bethesda and there's the pool of Siloam. So now both of these have been discovered, and we see that John accurately described them pre-70 AD. So we know he was there, he knew what he was talking about. But we also have ancient manuscripts which describe reactions to the miracles of Jesus. So Celsus, which we mentioned earlier, he talks about the miracles of Jesus. His explanation is that Jesus learned magic when he was in Egypt, and so that's how he was able to perform miracles. We also have Josephus commenting on how Jesus performed some kind of paradoxical works. He doesn't really comment beyond that. He's fairly neutral, but he knows about Jesus doing some kind of miraculous works. The Mishnah talks about Jesus supposedly having the power of sorcery. Okay, so they're looking at it from he is performing miracles through the power of the devil. And in the Gospels, that's what we see some of the Jews accuse Jesus of as well. And then there's a Christian source, Justin Martyr, writing to the emperor, and he actually appeals to the records of Pontius Pilate to see how Pilate mentioned these miracles of Jesus. So we've got various sources. None of them deny that Jesus performed miracles. They just have different explanations of how that happened.
Now, the trial of Jesus is a particular area of focus that each of the four Gospels dedicates significant time to. What are the archaeological details that connect to the trial and crucifixion narratives?
From an archaeological and historical perspective, this section of the Gospels is incredibly interesting and quite amazing how much corroboration there is. So if you read through the trial narrative and you compare that to archaeological discoveries, what we see is there are 7 people in the trial narrative of the Gospels that have been confirmed through archaeological discoveries, and 5 locations. So we would start with the locations. We've got the Garden of Gethsemane, which it's an orchard, okay, an olive orchard, not a specific building, but we know where it is. We know it existed. And then we go to the house of the high priest, and there are actually more than one candidate for the house of the high priest in ancient Jerusalem. But we've got these priestly mansions. I have a preference of one over another for identifying it with the one that Jesus went to because of a stone weight inscribed that was discovered there with the name of one of the high priests. Then the next location we have is the hall of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin met, where Jesus goes before Caiaphas. We know where that was. We have a few column capitals from that building that are still in existence, even though the buildings themselves were completely obliterated in 70 AD. Then Jesus goes to the Praetorium, and the Praetorium was the Roman residence of the governor in Jerusalem, and that has been partially excavated. So we've got some really interesting aspects of that, like the stone pavement that's mentioned in John and the Gabbatha mentioned in John. We can identify those archaeologically still. Then we look at the people. You've got Annas, the former high priest. You have the acting high priest Caiaphas. You have Peter even. You've got Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. You've got Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, who Jesus sees briefly in the trial. And you've got Simon of Cyrene, who carries the crossbeam. And then finally, Jesus himself. So all these people are attested through archaeological inscriptions, some other finds in certain cases, and in ancient manuscripts. So it's quite incredible, I think.
Wow. Well, you call the rapid growth of Christianity during the lifetime of Jesus and in the decades after it uncanny. Can archaeology speak to the rapidity of this growth and why it happened and why it was so large?
Well, I think archaeology can show us that it was rapid and that it had a wide geographical distribution, because we start to see Christian symbols and Christian inscriptions pop up all over the ancient Roman world, certainly in the 2nd century. And then it becomes more and more prolific by the 3rd century. And then in the 4th century, it's just everywhere. And so we see that it was quite a rapid and widespread movement just from the archaeology. And this is, of course, also confirmed by the historical sources in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries.
So he either had to be really good sorcery or he was onto something. Well, you point out that archaeological and manuscript discoveries over the last century are bringing about a lot of reevaluation and adjustment of many scholarly perspectives on Jesus in the Gospels. Would you say there's now a preponderance of evidence for Jesus in the Gospels, or do we have a ways to go or more to find?
I think we have a substantial amount of archaeological evidence that corroborates many different parts of the 4 Gospels. We have a lot to find. Just a very small percentage of sites really have been excavated, so there's a lot more out there. But we have enough to be able to say that these are historically reliable documents that have been confirmed by archaeology. And just one example of the shift in scholarship. So if you go back to the 19th century, some scholars were saying things like the Gospel of John was a totally unhistorical gospel. But now through archaeology, we can actually compare the descriptions of different buildings, not just cities, different buildings even, that John is describing in detail. And we can see that he got those right. He was, in fact, somebody recording accurate historical and geographical information, and not just giving us this spiritual fable.
That's a great example. And would you say that archaeology has slowed down in recent decades, or is it heating up? You know, is there more and more interest in confirming these things?
It goes through ups and downs. I think a lot of things are being worked on now, and many discoveries are made. You could probably say that at least one discovery each year is made that connects to something in the Bible. And sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, sometimes there are multiple finds. But right now we do have a lot of projects that are going on that do connect to biblical narratives.
Okay. And what about the technology used in excavations and surveying? Has that changed recently, or are we still using a lot of the same gadgets that they have been for the last century?
So archaeology has been adapting. Now it depends on the project leaders, but in general, archaeologists have been trying to adopt a lot of new technologies. This includes things like drones for photography or for LiDAR scanning, also ground penetrating radar to try to figure out better where specifically we should dig, where there might be some ruins of a building underneath. A lot of things done in the laboratory, not just radiocarbon tests, but things using mass spectrometers, for instance, that can test the elements that are found within the artifact, so we can more easily identify where they're from, their sources, what time periods they were made in based on how people used certain elements or certain materials in the past. Electron microscopes, a lot of computer programs now that will try to scan text even and do some work on analyzing the text and trying to translate some of that. High definition photography or infrared photography, CT scans. So all these kind of things where you can basically see things that you couldn't see before with the human eye, or you couldn't unroll a papyrus or something like that. But now they can do it with this technology. So a lot of things are being implemented and used, and it's advanced in some ways a lot. Whereas in other ways, going out on a site and actually doing the digging, we're still doing that by hand with almost the same tools, or in many cases the same tools as people were doing it 100 years ago. But that part of it, it's still effective, and we have to be there doing it by hand to make sure that things get done properly and don't get destroyed.
Okay. So some higher tech to assist along the way, but even low tech can be helpful. I read I can't remember which artifact you were talking about, but you mentioned that a rubbing had been taken and then the actual artifact broke or was damaged, and they used the rubbing to help them.
Yeah, that's the mesha stele. And so they were able to reconstitute it from the broken pieces because that rubbing had been made at its initial rediscovery.
Wow. Such intricate detective work goes into all of this. Well, that's all that we can do in this session, Titus, but let's come back one more time, a third session, to discuss your newest book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Biblical Lands. I'm excited about that one. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, Titus's latest book is now available. You can get it and other books that he's written, his other two, online from sources like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or through Harvest House Publishers. Until next time, I'm Andrew McDermott. Thanks for joining us.